I want to thank Geraldine and John and Michael and Catherine and the entire Finucane family for the invitation to give the annual Pat Finucane lecture. And I'm humbled and honoured to have the opportunity to remember the work, the courage and the leadership of Pat Finucane, a dedicated human rights lawyer. And while the focus of my remarks will be on Pat's work, we will also honour Pat the person, the Falls Road man, the son, the father, the brother and the husband, the quirky, clever, good-natured friend and family member. Tuesday is the 30th anniversary of Pat's death at the hands of a British state-sponsored death squad. He was just 39 when he was murdered. Next month, March the 21st, would have been Pat's 70th birthday. And as a human rights lawyer, it didn't matter to Pat whether you were a Republican, a Unionist, a Loyalist, or none of these. If you were arrested, you have rights, and Pat's responsibility, his vocation, his mission in life was to vindicate and defend these rights. Pat believed that the law should uphold and protect the rights of citizens. But he was not naive. He understood the difference between the theory and the practice in the application of human rights. That was part of his experience, part of his family's experience growing up in a sectarian orange state which didn't want them, and which denied them and hundreds of thousands of others their right to fair employment and decent housing. Pat grew up the eldest of a family of 8 in a working-class nationalist clan in West Belfast. He and I went to the same school, St Finian's or Bohernawall on the Falls Road, agus Scoilwire, Fosta and St Mary's as well. I was a year ahead of him. As a student in the late 60s and early 70s, Pat was inspired by the civil rights struggle. The Battle of the Bogside, the brutal response of the RUC and the British states, and the devastation caused by the pogroms of August 69 were also hugely influential on him. Bia Howlock in a honey asteroid Percy, Eganam Shin. The Finucane family lived in Percy Street, just across from St Comgall School on the Falls Road at that time. They were one of the hundreds of families in Belfast forced from their homes in August 1969. And from all these experiences grew a determination in Pat to challenge these injustices. That meant being the best human rights lawyer he could be. He graduated from Trinity College in Dublin and set up practice in Belfast. It was in Trinity that he and Geraldine met. He went on to be one of several lawyers who regularly worked with the Association of Legal Justice. The Association of Legal Justice was a voluntary organisation. It was established in 1970 to help the families of citizens being arrested every day by the RUC and the British Army. With little money and not a lot of legal expertise, Clara Riley, who's here today, Falshire Road, Clara. The late Leo Wilson, Anne Murray, Francis Murray, Father Brian Brady, and others worked day and night to provide support to desperate families. They were up against a British system that was constantly changing the rules of arrest, of interrogation and detention to suit their own political agenda. Getting information from British Army bases, from RUC barracks, about citizens detained was no easy task. Without the support and the assistance of Pat and other lawyers, the work of the ALJ would have been immeasurably more difficult. And looking back on it, these human rights defenders deserve our commendation and our thanks. Agus Tamwich, a lig buick Deebsha Gullier. The Finucane family endured much during this period. Pat's brother John, an IRA volunteer, was killed in a car accident in 1972. Another brother, Dermot, was imprisoned, and after escaping from Long Kesh in 1983, he fought a successful extradition case. Seamus was interned at the age of 16 in 1973 also. He was later imprisoned in 1976 after being arrested with Bobby Sands. Bhí aithne mai agamsa wahar Pat. Aber she lin a tehan am first to hear a re na blinta. I knew Pat's mother, Kathleen. Kathleen was a strong woman, widely liked and respected, good-humoured and resilient. Her husband died after the family home in Lenadoon was raided in September 1978. And the more I reflect on those days, the more I am in awe of the women in our struggle. From all sides, all our mothers, my own mother, Pat's mother, Geraldine, the mother of John, Michael and Catherine. What they put up with while rearing their families is heroic. And sometimes we take our mummies for granted. As MacParish wrote, Lord, you art hard on mothers. We suffer in their coming and their going. Kathleen Finucane was such a mother. And on her time, as we have heard from John, Geraldine also has become an outstanding mother on her own and a heroic woman who deserves our gratitude and deep appreciation for her courage, her determination, her grace, and her great humanity. Pat and Geraldine were married in 1972. I met Geraldine first when I called to see Pat in their flat in Lenadoon. He wasn't in. As usual, Geraldine might reflect. And that's when I first became aware of Pat's view of himself as a wonderful athlete and a soccer star. And later I was to admire photographs of him kicking a ball. The photographs were in the toilet in their new home in North Belfast. During these turbulent years, Pat's reputation as a hard-working, conscientious, enthusiastic, successful and skillful lawyer were growing. Bishé we brew a goni, Akmar near Kyle Shay a fe gran a Rio. Despite all of the difficulties, he never lost his sense of humour, he never lost his quirkiness. He worked long, demanding hours under trying and difficult conditions representing his clients. He was a lawyer working within a unionist and British-dominated legal and judicial process in which torture, in which the beating of detainees was part and parcel of the system of arrest and interrogation. The conveyor belt system was perfected in the mid-1970s as part of Britain's criminalisation strategy. The Special Powers Act was replaced with, among other repressive laws, with the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the Emergency Provisions Act. Forced confessions, which were usually the only evidence presented, were readily accepted by non-jury diplock courts. Evidence of ill-treatment in Castlereagh, Gough Barracks, the Strand Road and other torture centres was brushed aside, ignored, dismissed to facilitate the imprisonment of hundreds of men and women. By the way, in 1972, when I was arrested, I was one of those beaten repeatedly in Palace Barracks. And later in 1974 in Springfield Road Barracks, I was beaten unconscious again and again and again. And I tell you that just to personalise this. British Secretary of State Roy Mason, the Chief Constable Ken Newman, issued weekly statements boasting of the numbers arrested. Newman claimed that the prisoners were beating themselves up to discredit the IUC. And during this time, Pat defended many political prisoners. Later, during the hunger strikes, he went on to represent Bobby Sands and the women in Armagh and the Fear Plud, the blanket men's interests. And the little columns, the Choctorachta, the chocks that were written in cigarette papers, or bits of the Gideon Bible, and smuggled back and forth between the Fear Plud and the Sinn Féin POW department, Pat was known as the signer. Thug sé cuairteoir Bobby agus na blockan H neart ura. He visited the blocks many, many times. He visited Bobby many, many times. He witnessed the signing of Bobby Sands' nomination papers for the by-election in Fermanagh and South Tyrone. And he and Bobby developed a deep and solid friendship. Forbert sé Cargus Doan agus Leider le Bobby. And that's very, very clear if you read in the different writings that are there of Bobby, of the affectionate comments that he made to others on visits about Pat and his work for the prisoners. And later, when the Bobby Sands Trust was established, and when we began to publish Bobby Sands' writings, his short stories and poems, Pat was with Donnie Morrison and I at our first meeting with Captain John Feehan of Mercier Press. Pat was a member of the Bobby Sands Trust and our legal advisor. All the while, he was involved in a daily battle challenging the denial of rights to detainees, the beatings, the torture, the long periods of detention, the refusal to allow prisoners to speak with their lawyers. But let's reflect back. This was nothing new. This use of special courts, special laws, were all part and parcel of Britain's long experience of fighting colonial wars. After the Second World War, Britain was involved in at least 20 wars, which saw it withdraw from many former colonies, including Malaya, Kenya, Cameroon, Oman, Borneo, and Aden. And I was telling people recently, as part of the Ballymurphy Massacre story, that the first banner unfurled by the British Army, by a British Army riot squad in the Murph to instruct people to disperse, that first banner was in Arabic. Sin an Erin, no act na Gaeilge needed, no act na Arabic and sin. Brigadier Frank Kitson, who served in many of these wars, was the architect of Britain's counterinsurgency strategy here. This is all written down. This is not me making it up. The key objective of his strategy was to reshape the government, reshape the law, the judiciary, and the media, and to mould it into a weapon to subdue and suppress and pacify popular protests against their regime. And Kitson explains their thinking. He wrote, "The fundamental concept is that the working of the triumvirate, civil, military, and police, as a joint and integrated organisation from the highest to the lowest level of policy making, planning, and administration. In practice, this meant putting in place an overarching strategy to coordinate the legal, military, political, and media operations of the state. This meant the use of special courts, of special laws, of interrogation methods, the control of the judiciary and legal system, investment, we all remember, those of us of a certain age, political vetting, the economy, and influencing the media." Kitson was a pioneer of psycho-ops, psychological operations, and media manipulation by briefing and spin. His objective, and that of the British Army, RUC press operations, and the Northern Ireland office, was to turn journalists, as one reporter told the Savile Inquiry, into useful mouthpieces. Kitson rationalised his counterinsurgency strategy and the use of death squads. He wrote, "Everything done by a government and its agents in combating insurgency must be legitimate. But this does not mean that the government must work within exactly the same sets of law during an emergency as existed beforehand. The law should be used as just another weapon in the government's arsenal, in which it becomes little more than a propaganda cover for the disposal of unwanted members of the public." Sinné, all in that one paragraph. It becomes little more than a propaganda cover for the disposal of unwanted members of the public. That was exactly the opposite of Pat Finucane's understanding of the law. And that was the repressive system that he and other progressive lawyers had to constantly challenge. And every time Pat and the others identified a legal protection for citizens, the Brits simply changed the law. The result was an increasing arsenal of new and even more sophisticated and repressive laws. And all were designed to maximise the power of the state and reduce the rights of citizens. In the course of his work, Pat was at the forefront of the legal challenge to all these new coercive measures. By now, he and Peter Madden had founded their own law firm, Madden and Finucane. Agus tá mai ansas to Peter Madden, Ackroyd and Shaw and New Felchamore wrote Peter Madden. Pat was a familiar face on television news. He was televised leaving courts in Belfast, Lurgan, elsewhere. And many of those he was representing were the victims of the paid perjurer strategy, the families of shoot-to-kill victims, and citizens whose loved ones were killed as a result of state collusion with unionist death squads. And his devotion to human rights and Pat's diligence and his success made him a hate figure for many within the RUC and the British political establishment. They told unionist paramilitaries that he was a lawyer who was in the IRA. In November 1988, 4 senior officers of the RUC, including Chief Constable Jack Herman, the Deputy Head of the Special Branch, Brian Fitzsimmons, met with Junior Home Office Minister Douglas Hogg in Belfast. They told him that there were some lawyers in the north who were effectively in the pockets of terrorists. Hogg asked, who? They identified Pat Finucane. 2 months later, on January the 17th, Douglas Hogg, in a committee stage debate in the British Parliament, said, I have to state as a fact, but with great regret, that there are in Northern Ireland a number of solicitors who are unduly sympathetic to the cause of the IRA. Less than 4 weeks later, agents for the British Military Intelligence and the RUC Special Branch, agents of the state, paid for by taxpayers' money, also coincidentally members of the UDA, shot Pat and Geraldine in front of their children. And those who plotted and those who planned Pat's murder in the British government, within the RUC, in the British Army's Force Reconnaissance Unit, they thought, Sinead, that was it. They thought they'd silenced a good man, a Far Kroga, a brave man. They thought they had sent a clear signal, a clear warning to anyone else who dared to challenge them. But they reckoned without the courage and the resolve of Geraldine and the Finucane family and their many friends. They reckoned without the many families of victims of collusion who demanded and still demand truth. British government, their securocrats, their spies, their spooks have never been able to silence the Finucane family. Pat's name still haunts the corridors of power to this day. And together the family and you in this room and others in Britain and the USA and in Europe have been responsible for one of the most effective, high-profile and protracted justice campaigns ever mounted against the British security and political system and its apologists. Agus tá sogamsa go mé Pat an brutal le Geraldine agus a clan. I know that Pat would be enormously proud of Geraldine and his family and their amazing doggedness and tenacity in the face of indifference at times from the Irish government and countless efforts by successive British governments to marginalise and distract and silence them. In 2001, after years of campaigning, the British and the Irish government agreed at Weston Park to appoint a judge of international standing to undertake a thorough investigation into allegations of collusion in a number of cases, including the murder of Pat Finucane. A former Canadian judge, Peter Corey, was appointed to head this up. Later in 2003, the third report by John Stevens was published. Now, Stevens and his team were brought in here in 1989, again to investigate allegations of collusion. And they faced years of obstruction through their 3 separate investigations, including an attempt to destroy their files in January 1990. The facility the Stevens team was using outside Carrickfergus was regarded as one of the most secure policing facilities anywhere. And one evening, several of the Stevens team returned unexpectedly and discovered that the incident room was on fire. When they tried to set off the fire alarms didn't work. A heat-sensitive intruder alarm also failed. And when they ran to the guardhouse to phone for the fire brigade, they were told that the phones weren't working. Stevens and his team believed that those responsible for this attack of arson were from the Force Reconnaissance Unit, the unit responsible for running agents, including those who killed Pat Finucane. They also suspected that the Special Branch had helped through agents break into the office. John Stevens later said, "This incident, in my opinion, has never been adequately investigated, and I believe it was a deliberate act of arson." Later on, he said, "In almost 30 years as a policeman, I've never found myself caught up in such an entanglement of lies and treachery." In his third report, published in April 2003, Stevens dealt specifically with the murder of Pat Finucane on a Brian Adam Lambert. Brian Adam Lambert was a young Protestant university student who had been shot by the UDA in November 1987 in mistake for a Catholic. Stevens concluded, and I quote, "I have uncovered enough evidence to lead me to believe that the murders of Pat Finucane and Brian Adam Lambert could have been prevented. I also believe that the IUC investigation of Pat Finucane's murder should have resulted in the early arrest and detection of his killers. I conclude that there was collusion in both murders and the circumstances surrounding them." Now, it's worth noting that a man called William Stobie was arrested several weeks after the killing of Adam Lambert. Stobie had supplied the weapon used to kill Adam. But instead of being charged, he was recruited as an agent by the IUC Special Branch. And 14 months later, he supplied the weapons used to kill Pat Finucane. John Stevens later said, of 110 people he arrested about Pat's murder, 107 were being paid by some branch of the British system. Out of 110, 107 were being paid as agents. I often wonder what happened to the other 3. In April 2004, Judge Corey published his findings and concluded that in 5 of the 6 incidents he had investigated, inquiries should now proceed. And this included Pat's murder. As John has said, all of these inquiries have now concluded, except Pat's. Never even started. The British government tore up its commitment to hold an inquiry into the death of Pat. And then, in time-honoured fashion, they also passed a new law, the Inquiries Act in 2005, which gave ministers the power to block evidence to be given to an inquiry. Judge Corey accused the British of duplicity. He said, "It's like playing hockey. And instead of 6 to each team, you have 1 team with 8 and 1 with 4. And then in the middle of everything, you move the goalposts and you change the rules of the game." Lord Saville, who chaired the Bloody Sunday inquiry, also criticised the British government's decision. He said that giving a government minister the power to block evidence would make, and I quote, a very serious inroad into the independence of any inquiry and is likely to damage or destroy public confidence in the inquiry and its findings. As a judge, I must tell you that I would not be prepared to be appointed as a member of an inquiry that was subject to that type of provision. So what are the reasons for all of this, for all of these machinations, for all of these manipulations by the British government, by successive British governments? Simply put, the Pat Finucane case goes to the heart of collusion and the British state and the British system in this part of our country. It exemplifies the use of collusion through its exposure of the connections between the British government, its military and intelligence agencies, the RUC and Unionist death squads. It exposes the use of these death squads at the highest level of government. The British government's involvement in the mass murder of citizens and in the smuggling of weapons into this country to facilitate this. And collusion wasn't just the occasional use of spies or agents by the British operating within the IRA or loyalist paramilitary organisations. Collusion was a matter of institutionalised practice by successive British governments. It involved the establishment of unionist paramilitary groups, the systematic infiltration by the British of all of these groups at the highest levels, the control and direction of these groups, arming them, training them, and providing them with information on the people to be killed. Brian Nelson is one such person. A British agent was placed very high as intelligence director into the UDA, was provided with up-to-date intelligence by his handlers in the Force Reconnaissance Unit, and they protected him even after he was arrested by the Stevens team. And as well as being directly responsible for the killing of Pat Finucane and at least another dozen or more people, Nelson and his military handlers were responsible for bringing in a shipment of weapons in 1987 to 1988 to Unionist paramilitaries from the old apartheid South African regime. And if you check the record, you'll see the increase in the killing of nationalists and Republicans immediately following that. I had to cut my remarks, obviously, today. As John has said, in October 2011, Geraldine and her family met David Cameron in Downing Street. And it was widely expected, and the media were being briefed, that the British Prime Minister was finally about to announce the much-delayed public inquiry. Instead, he appointed a senior lawyer, Desmond De Silva, to review the papers in this case. And in his report, De Silva concluded in 2012 that members of the RUC had encouraged the attack on Pat Finucane, passed information on Pat to those who killed him, and failed to prevent his murder. And while the publication of the De Silva report was used as an excuse by the British government not to hold an inquiry, the evidence it presents in 829 pages only serves to reinforce the clear need for one. De Silva reported 85% of the intelligence that the UDA used to target people for murder was provided by the British Army and the RUC. There were 270 separate incidents of so-called leaks to the UDA between January 1987 and September 1989 from within the British Army, the UDR and the RUC. Agents working for MI5, RUC Special Branch and military intelligence were participating in criminality, including murder. There was no proper legal framework or guidelines to control the criminality of the actions of those who were called participating agents. The Brits' Northern Ireland office was, in De Silva's words, not overtly enthusiastic about attempts by some senior RUC and MI5 officers to introduce guidelines, despite representations at the highest levels. The issue was considered extensively at British cabinet level. Ministers were clearly aware that agents were being run without guidelines. The Director General of MI5 raised this matter with the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, in 1988. And all of this, De Silva said, was a willful and abject failure by successive governments to run agents lawfully. In other words, leaving the diplomatic language to one side, there was a willful and abject decision to run them unlawfully. And of the many damning conclusions by De Silva, he says, the real importance, in my view, is that a series of positive actions by employees of the state actively followed and facilitated Pat Finucane's murder. And in the aftermath of the murder, there was a relentless effort to defeat the ends of justice. In other words, what the family were campaigning for, what others who had lost loved ones were campaigning for, was being deliberately and willfully opposed at all levels. However, to our surprise, perhaps, or not to our surprise, despite clear evidence of the involvement by the different strands of the state, he said there was no overarching state conspiracy to murder Pat Finucane. The British Prime Minister said he was deeply sorry for what had happened. And he pointed out, or used, or excused, by using De Silva's claim that there was no political conspiracy, to rule out a full public and independent inquiry. And Geraldine succinctly, accurately summed up the British government's efforts. Agus bhí sí an dúireach, agus an leider, agus bhí sí go han sa leor. Geraldine was very clear, very strong, and very direct in what she said to this. She said, at every turn, dead witnesses have been blamed. Defunct agencies have been found wanting. Serving personnel and active state departments appear to have been excused. The dirt has been swept onto the carpet without any serious attempt to lift the lid on what really happened to Pat and many others. This report is a sham. This report is a whitewash. This report is a confidence trick dressed up as an independent scrutiny and given the invisible clothes of reliability. But most of all, most hurtful and most insulting of all, this report is not the truth. Well said, Geraldine Finucane. For almost 20 years, Pat Finucane battled every day in defence of the rights of his clients. And he did so in the face of an arsenal of repressive laws, as we have just outlined. And he did so against a system that does not believe that citizens have rights. It sees the law as just another weapon in its despicable campaigns. And today, the battle for the rights of citizens continues. The context, yes, is different. The rights issues may have changed, but the issue of rights for citizens, which was at the heart of Pat's efforts during his years as a human rights lawyer, is still as relevant today. These include prisoners' rights. There are other fundamental human rights available in every state on these islands except this one, which must be protected and advanced. These include marriage equality, Irish language legislation, women's reproductive rights, and legacy issues. And it's also true that the equality and parity of esteem components of the Good Friday Agreement have still not been implemented in full. There's a pressing need for a Bill of Rights as set out in the Good Friday Agreement, and which has been resisted by successive British governments and by the Unionist parties. And that is not good enough. A Bill of Rights is essential for the protection of citizens' rights, and Professor Colin Harvey, in a submission to the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Justice and Equality on the issue of rights and a Bill of Rights, said just last month, it's apparent that aspects of the 1998 agreement around identity are not well understood and are not fully reflected in domestic law, policy and practice. And he called for a Charter of Rights for the island of Ireland, which is part of the Good Friday Agreement. In its submission to the Oireachtas Committee, the Committee on the Administration of Justice warned that Irish citizens in the North may be reduced to the status of second-class citizens after Brexit. The CAJ pointed out that Irish citizens in the North will become EU citizens living, and I quote, in a non-member state, thus making their status constitutionally and practically uncertain and insecure. In December 2017, in the joint report produced by the European Union and the British government, paragraph 52 specifically stated that the people of the North who are Irish citizens will continue to enjoy rights as EU citizens, including where they reside in Northern Ireland. The Taoiseach stated at that time that everyone born in the North will continue to have the right to Irish and therefore EU citizenship. He also stated that the joint report was rock solid, cast iron and politically bulletproof. And in a response to a letter recently by representatives of civic nationalism, the Taoiseach assured them and us that the government had protected our interests. He said to all of us, your birthright as Irish citizens and therefore as EU citizens will be protected. He went on to tell us, you will never again be left behind by an Irish government. Now that was very welcome and a very positive commitment, but it has to be more than a clever soundbite. Many now believe that this promise, including me, has been broken. The specific commitment to citizens who reside in the North is missing from the withdrawal agreement published last November. And I have raised this many times in the Dáil, and the Taoiseach has yet to explain why the rock-solid, cast-iron and politically bulletproof joint report commitment of December 2017 is missing. Last week, the government in Dublin published its European Parliament elections bill, legislating for the European elections which are due to take place in May. And the EU had allocated 2 additional seats to the Irish state. And Sinn Féin and others urged the Taoiseach to allocate these 2 seats to the North, to ensure that citizens here who voted to remain would continue to be represented in the European Parliament. The government in Dublin said no. And we'll attempt to amend this, although I don't hold my breath, in committee. And on the back of very strong representation from Sinn Féin and others, the Irish government, in its lobby of our European neighbours on Brexit, rightly stressed and stresses the centrality of the Good Friday Agreement to the outcome of the Brexit negotiations. Yet, the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach repeatedly dismiss a part of that agreement. A referendum on Irish unity is a part of the Good Friday Agreement. It's a key provision and an integral part of that historic agreement. So the Irish government cannot cherry-pick the Good Friday Agreement. The days when citizens here in the North, when Irish citizens here in the North would meekly accept second-class citizenship, they're gone. They're over. They're finished. And those days ended whenever it happened in his head, when the likes of Pat Finucane decided to make a stand. That's when it ended. It takes a bit of while to work these things out, but that's when it ended, when people decided to stand up. So today we have a continuum of struggle. And to achieve positive change and to defeat resistance to the absolutely correct demand for rights requires a constant need for vigilance and a long-headed view of the past and very, very especially of the future. Agus caiimid a bheith ará a gcónaí ní neart go cur le héile. Unity is strength. For example, whatever about our criticisms of the European Union, we can hardly imagine the European Union telling the British that they cannot leave the European Union. You couldn't imagine the European Parliament telling the British that they're going to suppress the British Parliament. they're going to do away with the Parliament at Westminster. But that's what happened to us. When the people of Ireland voted to leave the British Empire, we were told you can't leave the British Empire. You have to stay in the British Empire. And when we elected the first Dáil 100 years ago, the British government suppressed it, outlawed it, and started a war. So I say all of that not for people in this room, but for the Taoiseach. That the Taoiseach needs to learn that it's not about Hugh Grant. That the Taoiseach needs to learn the lessons of history. The Taoiseach needs to know that the British government doesn't have friends. It has interests, and it always acts in its own interest. So the Taoiseach has to stand up to the Brits and stand by the Good Friday Agreement in all of its parts. He needs to have a consistent all-island vision. This is crucial. A consistent vision for the whole island of Ireland. He needs to have all-island objectives, because the Good Friday Agreement is an all-island agreement. In addition, he also has a responsibility, a constitutional responsibility, to promote the goal of Irish unity and to work to achieve it through democratic dialogue and negotiation. And we all know, we have all seen the threat that's posed to our rights and to our economies by the British, the English Tories. So this issue of rights is as important today as it was in Pat Finucane's time. And whether we're party political or not, the demand of all progressive people must be for a citizen-centred society in which everyone is equal under the law and where their rights and their entitlements are protected in the law. And all of us need to be part of that effort. We who are Republicans believe that this should include the basics of life, that it should be economic, it should be political and social, the right to a home, the right to a job, to access to education, to universal health care, to a clean and safe environment, to a life free from sectarianism. But whatever about that, I don't believe we're going to be able to fully achieve these rights until we have control of our own affairs, free from British involvement. And the Good Friday Agreement does set out a peaceful and democratic way to achieve that. So we're calling on the Irish government to establish a forum to sign up for the referendum on Irish unity, and unlike Brexit, to precede that with an informed and an inclusive debate. Shin Mamej, I just see, and you're always afraid to pick somebody out in case you miss somebody, but I just see PJ McGrory's daughter here. PJ was my lawyer for years, did an awful lot of terrific work. I see Slaner's wife here. I see lots of other victims of the conflict. And, you know, one of the things that I admire about the Finucanes is that they, in my opinion, I've never discussed this with any of them, are using the skills and the high profile that Pat had to help everybody else who doesn't have the same abilities. And Geraldine has reared, as a single parent, as a widow, a wonderful family. In the face of British government intransigence, the abject failure of successive Irish governments, it's truly inspirational to know these people. And I've repeatedly asked successive Taoiseach, we see at the moment how we can use our diplomatic abilities in our common good. However that turns out is another story. But I've repeatedly asked the successive Taoiseachs, going right back to Bertie Ahern, to undertake an international campaign in which all of the Irish diplomatic services are enlisted, to expose British duplicity and to demand the inquiry that the Finucane family were promised. And to their shame, so far, they have refused. Yes, the Taoiseach may raise it, yes, in an occasional conversation on the margins of a meeting, But there's been no consistent, no planned, no strategic programme of work to mobilise international and diplomatic support for the public inquiry into Pat Finucane's murder. And that also is not good enough. It's a very reasonable demand. I want to wish Geraldine and her children and grandchildren well in these difficult times. And you know, I believe that you can rely on all of us throughout it all. And you know also that there are people here in this country and in Britain and in the USA who have supported you for the last 30 years and will continue to do so. And that will be true when the British Supreme Court gives its judgment, which is due to do in the next short while. Pat was a decent human being. He dedicated his life to helping others. He was a family man. He loved Geraldine. He loved his 3 children. He loved his siblings. And in places where rights were constantly denied, Pat was a fighter for rights. Balake, he didn't need to do it. He didn't need to do what he did. Many of us, and I include myself in this, benefited from his bravery and his expertise. He was a hero. And today, the defence of human rights is important as ever. In our own place, in Gaza, in Africa, in Latin America, and other places. And, you know, just as I conclude, why does the British establishment go to such lengths to cover up its misdeeds? You ever wonder about that? Is it arrogance? Is it imperial values? They think they still have an empire. We're it. Is it racism? Is it some sort of superiority complex? Well, it's all of these, and it's more. But it also needs to protect its agents and its operatives, because be sure, the British and their allies use the same strategies in other theatres of war at this time. In Iraq, in Libya, in Afghanistan. Wherever the British establishment engages in military operations, these methods are still being used. And the British establishment has a need to protect those who act on their behalf. So, there are also human rights defenders, lawyers, trade unionists, journalists, farmers, community voluntary activists throughout the world defending the rights of citizens. And it's important in this global battle for human rights that we all remember Pat Finucane. His life, his death are proof that one person, even at a huge cost for him and his family, that one person can make a difference. And we salute him for making a difference for us.